Alrighty, and welcome. Hope everyone is doing well. This is episode 3 of the Self-Selecting podcast. I appreciate all you guys tuning in. I was interested to see a handful of people on Spotify, so if you're listening in from there, thank you so much. Listening in from YouTube, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know what topics you want me to cover. I kind of just jumping into this today. Wrapped up a call this morning. I had a girlie who booked me for a consult. If you don't know, I do one-time consults where we can go over whatever you want. Like we can go over lab work. We can shoot the shit. I literally, part of our call this morning, she's like, hey, I need some clarity around something that happened within the industry and I just want to understand it. I'm like, wow, this has never happened to me before. Thank you. Excited to be your source of tea. Absolutely. I'll give you my input. We went over her lab work, and this is one of those things, like in her case, like she has a coach, well-known coach, and it's exciting that she was like, yeah, I want your advice. I want your input here. So we went through, top to bottom, went through her CBC, CMP. She didn't have a full hormonal panel, which is important. I think you guys, like, I always felt like I was getting robbed whenever I got my blood work back, because you go to your doctor and you're like, yeah, I want to get my hormones checked, which is already like fucking pulling teeth. It's already so hard just to get that. You're like, dude, click the buttons. That's all you got to do. You don't have to write a letter. You don't just check the boxes of the ones that I tell you to, please. Yet you get it back. Like you go, you do the appointment, you get the lab draw, you like, okay, so it's a whole thing. It's another like 10 days. You're still riding on this high of like, I want to see how bad my hormones are right now, and get them back. And it's like 2 values, maybe 3, maybe you get lucky and they throw like a T4 in there, which is not indicative of anything, like just so inconclusive at that point. It would be nice. It will be so nice if we could just go in and be like a menu, and just, I want this a la carte. Here are the ones I want to look at. I don't want to look at T4. Maybe you want to look at prolactin. Maybe you don't. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's not. All the add-ons, like it would be nice to just be able to tell them exactly what you want to see when you get that shit back. I mean, like I'm not sponsored. This sounds so like a sponsored post. Not sponsored. No sponsors other than like toxic. But anyways, Life Extension is the service that I use. It is an online service. God, this sounds like an ad read. It does. Yeah. Okay. Online service, a la carte, exactly what I just described, except you don't even have to go into a provider's office. All you have to do, get online, pick the labs that you want. They have a slew of male and female labs, very specific to what your needs are. All you do is buy it. You get sent the requisition form. Someone in Florida signs off, says, yep, this seems legit. So go draw your blood, and you do that. You book an appointment with LabCorp. They don't accept Quest. Print out the requisition form. Go get your bloods drawn. They'll send you the results back to you like in 10 days. So truly, that has been a lifesaver. I started doing that when I didn't have insurance. Like I was in one of those weird little mid-20s period where I just had a brief stint of no health insurance. I was like, okay, well, I need to get labs done anyway. And even once I got insurance, I was like, it's just not worth the squeeze. I don't want to go and tell my provider what I need and talk to them about what I do and bodybuilding and amenorrhea and justify and, oh, are you taking any medications? Well, I'm not telling you that because I don't want this to be a thing. Pretty much every time I've gone to a provider for lab work, they've had to, like, the easiest times they've been like, hey, just tell me you're irregular. Literally all you have to say is my period is irregular and I will write whatever you want. Even then I get it back, and it's not always what I want. And that's like the easiest it's been. There have been times, however, where I've gone in And the primary is laughed at me and been like, oh, you need to go see a specialist. So not only did I just waste this copay, which like, it's not about the money, but still it's about it's about the time. It's about the time. It's about the booking the appointment, the getting there, the parking, all of it. It's a thing. And it drives me insane. It drives me insane, the hoops, when it should be easier. It should just be streamlined. So life extension, that's my preference. Even now with health insurance, I'm like, I do not want to waste an afternoon. I will just one-stop shop, click here, take my money, tell me where to go or whatever. So anyways, getting back to the consult I had this morning. So this individual brings me her blood work, and she has some concerns. I mean, from a health standpoint, perfectly, like lipids, beautiful, liver enzymes, kidneys, everything looks fantastic. But she is working with a clinic right now who is only willing to provide pellets for HRT. You know, she's 35 and she's like, I don't know if I'm ready to make that decision yet. Like, is this something that's going to get better? Also, is there that big of a difference between going the pellet route and not? And that's where like it kind of occurred to me, because she's like, yeah, like I've heard you talk about pellets, but I'm not very clear. And it's interesting because like from my perspective, I feel like I won't shut up about TRT. Like I have to resist the urge to bring it up because I'm like, I've already I've talked about it already this week. Like, hush. Yet sometimes I hear when I get on calls or when I talk to clients or whatever, someone's like, yeah, I wish you would talk more about it. I'm like, I talk about it all the time. Like what else do I talk about? Like that's really the bulk of it. Anyways, I guess, what I wanted to come on here and talk to you guys about, just run you through the differences, the roots of administration, because the call this morning, I mean, like it just, as I was going through each one, I was like, man, like maybe it has been a while, or maybe, new viewers, new listeners are interested in kind of the 101 of TRT administration, TRT, why that needs to be your base. And we'll just start with the administration. So, okay. Least favorable route of administration. So options, ways that you can take testosterone. So TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. Pellets are going to be my lowest on the totem pole. The reason being, this is something that's implanted into your body. So into your glute typically, which the girl this morning was like, hey, like I've heard that it can like lead to scarring. Like it can lead to like, I think it's called lipodystrophy. I could be fucking that up completely. But scar tissue development where it's implanted, which literally for bikini, I'm like, or wellness or anything, any bodybuilding, glutes are like, that's our centerpiece. Put it anywhere else. Put it in my calf, put it in my bicep, my delt. I don't care. My glute, that's literally the one place I would rather you not. It doesn't make sense. Anyways, put it in your body. Now they're trying to sustain that load, that anabolic load, the testosterone dose. It has to pulsate for the next 3 to 6 months. So, I mean, you're putting in an amount that can withstand that. Now, I've never seen individuals come back to me who have not been in the 200, 300, 400 range after being on pellets. And typically what I see is individuals who are put on pellets then ultimately begin to experience these high levels of hirsutism, or I guess high frequency of hirsutism. So like facial hair growth, tends to be some report of like acne, oilier skin, much higher sex drive, but like also just like a heightened state emotionally. That's at least been the reports I've received. Which like everyone has different thresholds for this, and to some degree, like I think it's like with age over time, like 10% of women are gonna experience hirsutism. So all the more the cosmetic changes, like darkening of like facial hair, acne, things like that. I guess I keep saying acne related to hirsutism, but it's not hirsutism, but I kind of put the two in the same, as in they're not equivalent to like a change in vocal pitch, clitoral enlargement, anatomical changes like in facial structure. Those are the ones that people are really concerned about. Whereas like some women are very tolerant of acne, of changes in hair growth. And I guess that's where I just like look at, okay, the route of administration versus the therapeutic index. Well, yeah, when we look at testosterone in itself is highly androgenic. Like the anabolic, Jesus Christ, the ratio, anabolism versus androgenicity, that potential. It's not comparable to a DHT derivative. A DHT derivative, anavar, primomasteron, these are ones that are modified in their intended, I guess maybe the primary intention was to find an alternative to providing that anabolic potential. And I mean, like, masteron had a different intention than anavar. So I mean, I'm not going into that here, but my point is, like, when you look at testosterone, the drug itself, we have to be very realistic about what the risks are, and the risks are very high if misused, if misdosed. And for me, when I consider something that, I mean, like, you're implanting it and then it's going to lie dormant in I guess not dormant, but it's going to be pulsating over an extended period of time. That worries me. It worries me that you're going to have this in place. And I mean, this is your first go round too. Like, this is not, oh, we know that this equates to this level. You're testing it out, like your sensitivity. This is highly individualized, and this doesn't even encompass where your SHBG is, where your free test is. So SHBG and free test, you have a low SHBG inversely correlates with a higher free test. Higher free test means that your body is able to capitalize on the total circulating free test, and thereby utilize more of it inversely. So if you have a higher SHBG, which is a very common occurrence, like in the case of individuals using like synthetic hormones, so like birth control, you have a lower free test. So even if you have a very high circulating total testosterone, your body's not able to capitalize on it as much. This is also separate from an individual's DHT levels, which can have an impact then on these symptoms, these side effects, these effects. That's really what we should call them, because they're anticipated. The androgenic potential is just as expected, or should be just as expected as the anabolic potential. Oftentimes we categorize these things into two separate groups. Like, these are the negative, the unwanted side effects, which I'm guilty of categorizing them like that publicly as well. Whereas the anabolism, oh, we want that. We want to experience that muscle growth, when in reality, we don't really get to treat this like a buffet. Like, we have to accept the good and the bad. Like, beggars can't really be choosers here. And because of that, I tend to be very conservative with the routes that I would deem acceptable. And I tend to be a little pushier when it comes to individuals who are not needle averse, who are like, I'm okay with needles. I would prefer not to. I'm like, okay, well, let's then weigh out the pros and cons of going to a non-injectable route. So you have pellets. Okay. Least favorable because you're loading it in a way that ultimately you just got to wait it out at that point. So you're committing to 3 to 6 months on a dose that is unclear, and you're hoping that it doesn't result in the development of at least these cosmetic side effects, but I mean, even more so, hopefully not true virilization. Well, and I mean, like, I've yet to have providers who have gone as, I've yet to speak with clients who've worked with providers who've gone as deep as like, hey, we need to monitor for these side effects, for these voice changes, for this clitoral growth, which is sad. Like, yeah, we hear about individuals who are told like, hey, like be mindful of like skin changes, hair changes, like, you know, definitely like monitor libido and see like, do you feel any better? But when it comes to these irreversible changes, or these changes that for many are jarring, like the average person, like someone who's not in bodybuilding, I gotta be honest, like we really have to consider whether the individual is truly informed about the risk. Like they go into their provider and they say like, I want to feel better. I don't want to feel like I am menopausal or premenopausal, perimenopausal. Are they informed that like, hey, if we fuck this up, you could feel worse than you currently do without drugs, depending on what your definition of femininity is. You could feel worse, depending on how sensitive you are to changes like in scale weight, in, you know, fluid retention. And anyways, that's where the dosing, gosh, it's so important, because we only need a small amount, a very small dose to achieve normal to normal high levels. And when you consider that in relation to inaccurate forms of dosing, well, it's like, okay, past pellets, I don't consider pellets very accurate. They can't be titrated once it's implanted. Okay, well then what about creams? What about nasal spray? What about, I know there are lymphatic methods, which is, I'm not as versed in. I mean, like, shout out Kyle Gillette, like he talks about this a bunch and how these are promising, but they do still need to be studied. Oh, sorry, excuse me. But when we start looking at like topicals, okay, well, I don't know about you guys, but like the administration of topicals, I tend to be very weary about, just given the versatility in someone's metabolism, specifically in the bodybuilding space. I really don't like the idea, particularly if this is going to be more of like a hands-off intervention. Like if the provider's just going to give it to the client and tell them to titrate it, which I see that pretty common as well, where individuals are like, the instructions around this were, yeah, go off how you feel, like day to day, which is just completely mental. Like how you feel, that should not be dictating a drug, period, but let alone a drug with a very, very narrow window for safety. And that is what testosterone is. So, you know, we look at the creams, we look at the effects here, which, there does seem to be some correlation with a higher free test, I believe, if I'm recalling this correctly, a higher free test associated with topical creams, which, I mean, truly that could be problematic for someone whose free test is already a little high. So, I mean, like understanding these roots, understanding their role relative to the individual themselves and where that individual's starting point is, I mean, I think is essential. And I think sadly, there's such a big gap in the modern day understanding around virilization, the cost of being too aggressive out the gate, and why we shouldn't let qualitative data override serum levels, particularly with a drug like this. So, you know, nasal sprays, I think the idea of that sounds very promising. Even the lymphatic ones, I'm like, okay, I'm open to it. But for the time being, like injectables, that is where I see the most accuracy coming from. That is where I believe we can do our due diligence in, at least as like coaches in the space, offering individuals the safest route at which in which they can achieve, normal to high levels. And, yes, even within injectables, there are discrepancies depending on how much you're drawing up from. Like if you were drawing up from a bottle that is concentrated for a male, so when I started TRT, like I drew up from Patrick's bottle. I mean, it was 200 milligrams per ml. And first set of labs I got back, like they were, I think 140. They were a little high, and like, oh, okay, well we gotta find an alternative here. So, I mean, naturally the route I took was finding a source that then reached out to a compounding pharmacy, which is ironic because it's like that's exactly what MPs and providers can do. Like they are able to do this. It's just a matter of like knowing whether or not there's a need, getting them to compound it, which here in California, I believe now is becoming more problematic. I think that's actually in the last year or two has become something that is no longer feasible. But I digress because I'm not entirely sure. Getting a bottle that was concentrated at a low enough dose. So for me, that's 10 milligrams per ml that allows me to do daily injections as opposed to having to drop from a bottle that's so heavily concentrated, and ultimately kind of getting backed into the corner of having to dose higher than I like. This is what I see when people come to me. Usually coming from a clinic setting, they're drawing up from a bottle that's anywhere from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams per ml. The lowest they can really pull up to is like the 0.05 ml mark. So, I mean, like we're talking like a very, very small amount. And even then I've heard people come to me who are like, oh, I was told to drop to 0.02 mLs. And it's like, yeah, there's still going to be some error, like in the actual needle itself, the syringe itself. And that can influence the accuracy. And I mean, the best case scenario is we aren't working within such tight parameters when we're actually drawing up the drug itself. Like the volume should allow for consistent dosing. And I think that becomes harder and harder the higher concentration you're dealing with and the lower dose you're aiming to achieve. So with this, I mean, like I don't have a great solution. I know there are ground level businesses that will offer 50 milligram per ml bottles. And I do encourage people like, hey, if that's what you have access to, like, yeah, you might not be able to do daily dosing. Maybe you can, but like, I would certainly opt for that and even do once or twice, or would for sure do once a week, but preferably 2 to 3 times a week if you can swing it. And in that case, like, I mean, still starting 3.5 milligrams per week, so 0.5 milligram a day. If you must, let's say you don't have access to that. Let's say you truly are like, oh, well, I have been through a few clinics. It's expensive at this point. I can get 100 milligrams per ml. I mean, if that's the case, then yeah, like then do that. But you're probably going to put yourself in a position where you do need to monitor a little closer, a little more closely. And maybe that does mean starting at 5 milligrams, but know that long term, if levels are above 100 nanograms per deciliter, you do increase the odds that you will experience some aspect of change. It doesn't mean if you're 101 or 110 or 150 even that like there is going to be this linear correlation, but the total dose and then the duration of use, like, and if this is going to be something that is a lifelong therapy, if it's going to be something you have in place indefinitely, you have to consider that. Like, I mean, are you 26? Like I started when I was 26. I mean, like this is a huge consideration for me. If I'm having it in for the next, let's say 50 years, like I do have to anticipate like how much of that time, how long can levels be supra physiological before there's a change, before there's something that happens that I'm not comfortable with. And is it worth risking that? Because once it starts to happen, I mean, like you're really not left with much of an option other than to come off. I mean, like, sure, you can lower your dose, but I don't want to get to that point. I don't want to have to be put in that position where I am making that decision. So yeah, when we talk about these roots, there's a lot of individuality that comes into play here in the decision making process. And with this girl this morning, she's 35 and she's like, I want to make sure I'm getting the most from what I'm doing, but I also I don't want to use something unnecessarily. And I mean, that was what I gathered from her, which I respect a lot. So, I mean, what are the options prior to starting TRT? I mean, in my opinion, if you're going to be competing, particularly if you're going to be using drugs, if you're going to be using anabolics, I think this is the step that needs to occur prior to. If you've already made the decision that you want to use something like Anavar, SARMs, you're already, you want to use an anabolic or a SARM, I would be aware of just of the order in which you should do things, just from a safety standpoint. It is safer to have TRT in place. It's the only anabolic, it's the only steroid that we can measure in serum levels. And frankly, it's you need these hormones, to do this sport, you need these hormones to not be suppressed. So really, when I weigh the cost benefit, I'm if you're going to be in this sport for an extended duration, what are you waiting on? Particularly if you're going to be competing frequently, back-to-back seasons, it's your hormones aren't, unless you're highly resilient, which even top athletes, you can say they're highly resilient. It doesn't mean their hormones aren't suppressed. Well, it's kind of do you want to be on and off cycle, ultimately pulling hormones back down, waiting for them to come back up just to do the same thing again? Or do you just want to have a constant in place? And personally, I made that decision. I had already started DHEA. I'd already seen, okay, this is what I feel like having normal to normal high levels. I mean, the DHEA I was on, I was on 100 milligrams. I was on a lot. And it took my test to 70, 80. I mean, it took it to a good range. And definitely saw the physique improvements. I was in prep, so it's hard to say. Physique looked as you would expect during prep, but it didn't mitigate any of the issues with ovulation. I still had low estradiol, low progesterone, but it did correct the test. It did correct the low test, and I think DHEA and boron, that's a suitable option if you're on the fence, if you're not ready to commit to TRT, but you're hey, I do want to ensure that I've done everything prior to. I don't want to be forced into this decision. I don't want to make it before I'm ready. That makes sense to me. Another aspect to this that we discussed this morning was what can be done on the back end, from a lifestyle modification standpoint. And this one, I think is very tricky, but typically what we see is individuals in this sport, they're already on top of all of their controllable variables. So most people, it's very rare that I run into someone who's oh yeah, my sleep is really shitty and I just am not motivated enough to improve it. If you're committed to improving your physique, you tend to have an understanding around the role that sleep, hydration, diet, stress management play in what we do in physique outcomes. I mean, that's typically why you're even having a consult with me at this point. It's you're trying to maximize everything that you're doing. So let's say the individual comes to me and they're not, though. They're not, they don't fall in that typical demographic. Well, I kind of have to look at the specifics. Okay, do you work night shift? And have you been in a position where you're I have to get out of this? I have a girlfriend who she's was a new grad. I mean, now is no longer bedside, but she started day shift. That was stressful. Switched to night shift, even more stressful because then the physical component of a constant irregular circadian rhythm. And then she switched to working in a clinic and working days, but a much different setting. So much lower stress than working daytime 12s. And in her case, like if like hypothetically, if I'd been working with her and we were looking at her hormones, like from when she started working day shifts, then working nights, then working at the clinic, I would be like, well, like you have the opportunity and the ability to make these changes to your schedule. Like, we should really see how much of an impact that plays. For most people, that's not going to be feasible. Like, I can't tell someone, be like, oh yeah, just eliminate all stress from your life. Just make it to where your stress is as minimal as possible. Like that's most people are going to laugh, be like, what? I just get rid of my kids, get rid of my spouse, like, oh, financial troubles, just don't worry about, keeping a roof over my head. Like, yeah, I see this too with people who travel a lot for work. There's a few people that come to mind who like do a really good job with, managing what they can, but undoubtedly, like, I'm sure you would see that correlation reflected in their hormone profile, like the state that they're in relative to how little sleep they get, relative to how much stress they incur. And again, that is very, very individualized, because there are people who do that for a living who manage it like incredibly well. Like it's not stressful for them. It's just the way they live. It's what they signed up for. And like, they're very comfortable with that lifestyle. Whereas some other people, and one of my best friends talked yesterday, and he's like, oh, fuck that. Like, I'm not traveling 2 weeks in a row, like with like a break in between. Like, no, that I wouldn't be able to handle that. And it's a difference in pacing. It's a difference in your experience and your skill of being able to manage that stress. And I would say in the case of someone who has the ability to modify like a significant aspect of their lifestyle, that likely is contributing to their ability or to their hormonal state, particularly like with sleep or stress. If we can modify it, great. I think it's more of a rarity for someone to be in that position and to not actively be seeking a change from whatever they're in, whatever situation they're in. Like individuals in stressful relationships, if that's something that is chronically like becoming an issue, like I would assume you're going to do what you can to get out of that. I would assume you're not going to just stay there. But there are a lot of people who are in positions where they can't modify that stress. And if that's the case, if like you're already doing everything that you can on your end, if you're like, yeah, I work night shift, I'm not able to alter my schedule, like that's just a requirement of my job. Okay, well then we have to consider that a fixed variable. We can't control that. Same thing with kids. I know a lot of you guys, y'all have families, you have other responsibilities. Maybe you're going back to school, maybe you're working full time. And in that case, it's like, yeah, you're in nursing school, you're working full time. Like, sorry, it's going to suck for that year or two that you're putting your head down, you're just working. Like, let's make the most of it. Maybe you don't start TRT, maybe we start DHEA, but past the point of what is modifiable, I do really want to consider relative to competing, like the impact competing has on your hormonal state. Ultimately, you are just going to be like you're not going to be in a state for these hormones to remain balanced, because every time you get back to that low body fat level, unless you were extremely resilient, and even then it's unlikely as a female, you're probably going to see that dysregulation. And then I have to ask, okay, fertility, if that is a consideration here, how many times are you willing to pull your hormones back down into this state before we begin to see this transpire into long-term effects? Like even if we know, okay, there isn't necessarily a direct correlation between competing and infertility, we know that infertility is influenced by chronic periods of anovulation. Like fertility is something that is highly genetic, but then also influenced largely by the intrinsic environment. So, without going any further outside my scope, I think it's something that we have to be honest about with our sport. Our sport is not conducive with staying fertile. It doesn't mean that competing once is going to cause you to be infertile, but competing extensively, competing in settings that are very harsh, that are very unfavorable, these environments are not conducive with preserving fertility. They're a state that will exacerbate the risk of problems, whether that be infertility or just, more acute problems. But I think that's where I kind of want to wrap this, is the role that our hormones play in our ability to do this sport is very significant. And particularly with testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, we have to consider that we have a direct influence on these hormones with what we're doing to our bodies. And it's not optimal. It's not the best decision to lean into the belief that going about it naturally is technically healthier than considering a supportive therapy if this is going to be a long-term endeavor. I don't think it's that black and white. I think I get where the belief comes from, but I just think when we look at the long-term effects of this sport and the long-term effects of this sport without supportive therapy in place, I mean, we really have to consider that there are individuals who are just further smashing these hormones down, and maybe it wouldn't make a difference. Maybe if they weren't in the sport, just simply their level of resilience would ultimately result in the same outcome. And if that's the case, okay. But as coaches, as like figures of authority in some capacity, we have to recognize that like there's a cost for not acting, like for not putting something in place. Even if it feels like this is the right thing, even if it feels like, oh yeah, like we're going to send him to an HRT clinic, or we're going to send him to a wellness center and let them defer to the experts. It's like, yeah, but the experts aren't always going to fully understand what we're doing to our bodies. And at times they cannot understand the impact of these drugs on our systems. So it's important that we're advocating for our clients, and as clients, we're advocating for ourselves, particularly when having this interdisciplinary approach and care team with several varying backgrounds and biases. So anyways, I hope y'all like this one. I hope it was helpful. As always, thank you guys for watching, listening from wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.